At 3 a.m., a scream shattered the stillness of the Forbidden City. Emperor Chongzhen had seen it all in a dream, his dynasty dying in flames, rebel flags at his gates, and his own hands tightening a silk cord on a lonely hill. But what if that nightmare wasn't just prophecy, but the very thing that destroyed an empire? This is the story of how a dream became destiny, driving the last Ming emperor to make fatal choices that invited the fall of a 300-year dynasty. Comment your theory, like if the past felt eerily real, and subscribe to uncover how a dream doomed a civilization. The scream that shattered the silence of the Forbidden City at 3 in the morning on October 15, 1644, would echo through Chinese history for centuries to come. Emperor Chongzhen of the Ming Dynasty awoke in his golden chambers, his silk robes soaked with sweat, his heart pounding like war drums against his ribs, as the most terrifying vision he had ever experienced slowly faded from his consciousness. In his dream, he had seen the great dragon of his dynasty writhing in agony, its scales falling like autumn leaves, its mighty roar reduced to a death rattle as dark shadows consumed the celestial empire from within. The emperor had ruled China for 17 years, weathering rebellions, famines, and invasions, but nothing had prepared him for the paralyzing terror of a nightmare that felt more real than reality itself, a prophetic vision that would drive him to make the catastrophic decisions that ultimately destroyed the oldest continuous dynasty in human history. The golden chambers where Chongzhen experienced his fateful nightmare were themselves symbols of the imperial isolation that had cut the Ming dynasty off from the pulse of Chinese society. These rooms, decorated with dragons carved from jade and phoenixes painted in gold leaf, had been designed to create an atmosphere of supernatural grandeur that would reinforce the emperor's divine status. But on that October night, the opulent surroundings seemed to mock the emperor's terror, their frozen perfection contrasting sharply with the chaotic visions that had invaded his sleep. The silence that followed his scream was not peaceful but ominous, the kind of quiet that settles over a battlefield after the dying have drawn their last breaths. The emperor's personal servants, eunuchs who had been trained from childhood to anticipate his every need, were thrown into confusion by his unprecedented display of fear. These men had witnessed Chongzhen face military defeats, natural disasters, and political crises with stoic composure, but they had never seen him reduced to the trembling, sweat-soaked figure who now sat upright in his bed, staring at shadows that seemed to move independently of any earthly light source. The chief eunuch, Li Ruolian, would later record that the emperor's eyes held a quality of absolute terror that suggested he had seen not just his own death, but the death of everything he held sacred. Dreams held sacred power in Chinese imperial culture, believed to be messages from the ancestors, or warnings from the heavens themselves. The emperor was not merely a political ruler, but the son of heaven, a divine intermediary whose spiritual connection to the cosmic order was reflected in his nocturnal visions. When Chongzhen described his nightmare to his court astrologers and Confucian advisors, their faces paled with a terror that matched his own. The dream was interpreted as an unmistakable omen of dynastic collapse, a heavenly mandate withdrawn, a cosmic judgment that could not be appealed or reversed through earthly means. The emperor's nightmare featured recurring symbols that had appeared in Chinese prophetic literature for millennia. The dying dragon represented the imperial bloodline, the falling scales symbolized the loss of territorial control, and the consuming shadows represented barbarian invasions that would sweep away Chinese civilization itself. The imperial tradition of dream interpretation had been refined over thousands of years into a sophisticated system that treated nocturnal visions as a form of divine communication requiring expert analysis. The court maintained an entire bureaucracy dedicated to recording, analyzing, and responding to imperial dreams, with different specialists responsible for interpreting various types of symbolic imagery. Dragons, phoenixes, mountains, rivers, colors, numbers, and celestial phenomena all carried specific meanings that could be combined to decode the heavenly messages contained within the emperor's sleeping mind. This system had served previous dynasties well during periods of stability, but during times of crisis, it could amplify fears and anxieties into paralyzing obsessions. The chief court astrologer, Zhang Kentang, was a man whose reputation rested upon his ability to find favorable interpretations for even the most ominous imperial dreams. But Chongzhen's nightmare defeated his considerable skills. Every symbol in the vision pointed toward the same conclusion: The Ming dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and was doomed to destruction regardless of any earthly actions the emperor might take. Zhang's attempts to find alternative meanings for the dream's imagery were unconvincing even to himself, and his failure to provide reassurance only deepened the emperor's conviction that his dynasty was facing supernatural rather than merely political opposition. What made Chongzhen's dream particularly terrifying was its specificity and accuracy. In his vision, he saw rebel armies dressed in red bandanas storming the gates of Beijing, while Manchu horsemen in distinctive armor watched from the hills like vultures waiting for carrion. He witnessed his own palace guards abandoning their posts, his concubines fleeing in terror, and his own children crying out for protection that would never come. Most haunting of all, he saw himself standing alone on Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City, a silk cord in his hands, preparing to end his life, rather than face capture by enemies who would desecrate everything he held sacred. Every detail was burned into his memory with supernatural clarity, from the color of the rebel flags to the sound of his empress weeping in the abandoned throne room. The prophetic dream also contained auditory elements that made it feel more real than ordinary nightmares. Chongzhen reported hearing the specific battle cries of Li Zicheng's rebel army, the thundering of Manchu cavalry charges, and even the creaking of the rope that would eventually end his life. These sounds had a quality that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating directly within his consciousness with a clarity that no waking experience had ever matched. The emperor became convinced that he had not merely dreamed about the future, but had actually visited it, witnessing the final moments of his dynasty with the helpless horror of a ghost, observing events that had already been determined by forces beyond mortal control. The emperor's response to his prophetic nightmare reveals the dangerous intersection between superstition and statecraft that would prove fatal to his dynasty. Instead of focusing on the practical military and political challenges facing his empire, Chongzhen became obsessed with preventing the specific scenarios he had witnessed in his dream. He ordered massive resources diverted to supernatural countermeasures. Taoist priests were summoned to perform elaborate rituals designed to strengthen the imperial dragon's cosmic power. Buddhist monks chanted protective mantras day and night in the palace temples, and court astronomers worked feverishly to identify auspicious dates for military campaigns that might alter the dynastic fate revealed in the dream. The financial cost of these supernatural interventions was staggering, consuming resources that could have been used to address the very real economic and military problems that were destabilizing the empire. Entire provinces were taxed to pay for elaborate ceremonies designed to appease celestial forces, while the imperial treasury funded the construction of new temples and the commissioning of protective talismans rather than investing in weapons, fortifications, or soldier salaries. The emperor's supernatural response to his nightmare created a vicious cycle where the empire's practical problems grew worse precisely because resources were being diverted to address imaginary spiritual threats. The Taoist rituals commissioned by the emperor were based on ancient texts that promised to manipulate cosmic forces through carefully choreographed ceremonies involving specific combinations of incense, music, dance, and sacrifice. These rituals required hundreds of participants, months of preparation, and enormous quantities of precious materials, including silk, jade, gold, and rare herbs. The ceremonies themselves were theatrical spectacles designed to demonstrate the emperor's connection to divine power, but they also served to reinforce his belief that supernatural intervention was more important than practical action in determining the fate of his dynasty. Li Zicheng was the rebel leader whose red-bannered army had appeared so vividly in the emperor's nightmare, but the historical Li was far from the supernatural threat Chongzhen imagined him to be. Born into a peasant family in Shanxi province, Li had become a rebel almost by accident, driven to banditry by the crushing taxes and natural disasters that were destroying rural China. He was an intelligent and charismatic leader, but hardly the demonic figure that haunted the emperor's dreams. Li's rebellion succeeded not because of any supernatural power, but because the Ming government had become so obsessed with prophecies and omens that it lost sight of the real grievances driving ordinary Chinese people to desperate resistance against imperial authority. The transformation of Li Zicheng from government employee to rebel leader illustrates how the Ming dynasty's administrative failures created the very threats that appeared in the emperor's prophetic dreams. Li had originally worked as a postal relay station attendant, a low-level government position that provided steady income and social respectability. However, budget cuts and corruption had eliminated thousands of these positions, throwing loyal government workers into poverty and desperation. Li's personal journey from imperial servant to imperial enemy was replicated by millions of Chinese people who found themselves abandoned by a government that seemed more interested in cosmic harmony than earthly welfare. Li's military genius lay not in supernatural powers, but in his understanding of how to transform widespread popular discontent into effective military organization. His rebel army was composed primarily of displaced farmers, unemployed craftsmen, dismissed soldiers, and other victims of the Ming dynasty's administrative collapse. These men fought with desperate courage because they had nothing left to lose, and their intimate knowledge of local terrain and popular sentiment made them far more effective than the demoralized professional soldiers sent to suppress them. Li's red bandanas became symbols of hope for the oppressed, rather than demonic emblems of supernatural evil. The emperor's fixation on his nightmare led him to make increasingly irrational military decisions that fulfilled the very prophecies he was trying to prevent. When his generals advised concentrating forces to defend Beijing against Li Zicheng's approaching army, Chongzhen instead dispersed his troops across multiple fronts, believing that the dream had shown him the importance of preventing any single enemy from becoming too powerful. When his advisors recommended negotiating with the rebels to address their legitimate grievances, the emperor refused, convinced that his nightmare had revealed negotiation to be futile, since the cosmic mandate had already been withdrawn from his dynasty. The strategic implications of the emperor's dream-inspired military decisions were catastrophic for Ming defensive capabilities. By dispersing his forces across multiple theaters, Chongzhen ensured that his armies would be too weak to achieve decisive victories in any single campaign. The rebels and Manchus were able to defeat imperial forces piecemeal, gaining momentum and resources with each victory, while the emperor's remaining troops became increasingly demoralized by an unbroken series of defeats. The nightmare that was supposed to warn the emperor about military disaster instead became the cause of that disaster through its influence on imperial strategic thinking. The psychological warfare employed by Li Zicheng's propagandists was sophisticated enough to exploit the emperor's obsession with prophetic dreams. Rebel agents spread carefully crafted rumors about additional nightmares that supposedly confirmed the Ming dynasty's doom, while promising that Chinese people who joined the rebellion would be spared from the cosmic catastrophe that was about to befall the empire. These false prophecies were designed to sound authentic, to people familiar with traditional Chinese symbolic systems, complete with references to classical literature and historical precedents. But they were actually calculated to increase panic and despair among potential Ming supporters. The Manchus, the northern barbarians, who had also appeared in Chongzhen's prophetic dream, were led by a brilliant military strategist named Hong Taiji, who understood Chinese culture and politics better than many Chinese officials. Hong Taiji had been carefully building a coalition of Chinese defectors, Mongol allies and Manchu warriors for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at a weakened Ming empire. When he learned through his extensive spy network about the emperor's obsession with prophetic dreams, Hong Taiji deliberately spread false intelligence designed to make Chongzhen believe that certain military strategies would prevent the scenarios shown in his nightmare, when in fact these strategies would make Manchu victory easier to achieve. Hong Taiji's intelligence network included Chinese scholars who had defected to the Manchu cause, bringing with them intimate knowledge of imperial court culture and decision-making processes. These defectors understood how the emperor's mind worked, particularly his tendency to interpret political challenges in supernatural terms, rather than addressing them through practical reforms. They were able to craft disinformation campaigns that played upon Chongzhen's worst fears, while simultaneously encouraging him to take actions that would weaken Ming resistance to Manchu expansion. The psychological warfare employed by Hong Taiji was sophisticated beyond anything seen in previous Chinese conflicts. Manchu agents infiltrated Chinese cities and spread carefully crafted rumors about additional prophetic dreams that supposedly confirmed the Ming dynasty's doom, while promising that Chinese who submitted to Manchu rule would be treated with honor and respect. These rumors were designed to sound like authentic Chinese prophecies, complete with classical literary references and traditional symbolic imagery, but they were actually psychological weapons intended to demoralize Ming resistance by convincing people that opposition to the Manchus was opposition to heaven itself. The cultural sophistication of Manchu psychological operations reflected Hong Taiji's understanding that conquest of China required more than military victory. It demanded the willing submission of Chinese intellectual and administrative elites who possessed the knowledge necessary to govern the vast empire. By presenting Manchu rule as a fulfillment of Chinese prophetic traditions rather than as foreign conquest, Hong Taiji made it psychologically easier for Chinese officials to justify collaboration with the new regime. This strategy proved far more effective than simple military intimidation in securing the cooperation necessary for successful imperial transition. Wu Sangui was the Chinese general whose betrayal would prove decisive in the final collapse of the Ming dynasty, but his treachery was motivated not by the emperor's dreams, but by a very earthly desire for revenge and survival. Wu commanded the crucial Shanhai Pass that controlled access between China proper and Manchuria, making him the key to any Manchu invasion attempt. Initially, Wu remained loyal to the Ming despite the chaos engulfing the empire, but when Li Zicheng's rebels captured Beijing and took Wu's beloved concubine Chen Yuanyuan as a trophy, the general's personal rage overcame his dynastic loyalty. Wu's decision to ally with the Manchus against Li Zicheng was driven by the ancient Chinese principle that personal honor trumped political allegiance when the two came into irreconcilable conflict. The story of Wu Sangui's betrayal reveals how personal relationships could override political loyalties in traditional Chinese culture, particularly when those relationships involved questions of sexual honor and masculine reputation. Wu's love for Chen Yuanyuan was well known throughout the imperial court, and Li Zicheng's seizure of the concubine was widely interpreted as a deliberate insult designed to humiliate the general and demonstrate rebel power over imperial military leaders. Wu's response was driven not just by romantic attachment, but by the social imperative to defend his reputation against public humiliation, even if that defense required betraying his emperor and dynasty. The military consequences of Wu Sangui's defection were immediate and catastrophic for any hope of Ming restoration. Wu's army was the most effective fighting force still loyal to the imperial cause, and his knowledge of Manchu military capabilities made him an invaluable ally for Hong Taiji's invasion plans. When Wu opened Shanhai Pass to Manchu forces and led his troops in joint operations against Li Zicheng's rebels, he effectively sealed the fate of both the Ming dynasty and Li's short-lived rebel regime. The general's personal vendetta had reshaped the entire balance of power in East Asia, demonstrating how individual decisions could determine the fate of civilizations. The fall of Beijing in April 1644 occurred exactly as Chongzhen had foreseen in his nightmare 6 months earlier. Li Zicheng's rebel army, weakened by the emperor's ineffective military responses, but strengthened by the desperation of millions of starving Chinese peasants, stormed through the city gates that had been left inadequately defended due to the emperor's mystical military strategies. The palace guards did indeed abandon their posts, just as the dream had predicted, but not because of supernatural forces. They fled because they had not been paid in months and saw no point in dying for a dynasty that seemed already dead. The siege of Beijing was less a military operation than a political collapse, as the emperor's obsession with his prophetic dream had undermined every aspect of imperial resistance. The city's defenses had been weakened by the diversion of resources to supernatural countermeasures. The garrison had been demoralized by months of defeats caused by dream-inspired strategic blunders, and the civilian population had lost faith in a government that seemed more concerned with cosmic harmony than earthly security. Li Zicheng's forces encountered minimal resistance because the Ming Empire had already defeated itself through the emperor's misguided response to his nightmare. The fulfillment of the dream's prophecies created a sense of inevitability that paralyzed the remaining Ming defenders. Palace guards who might have fought courageously under different circumstances found themselves unable to resist what seemed like the unfolding of predetermined fate. The psychological impact of the emperor's nightmare had spread throughout the imperial hierarchy, creating a collective sense of doom that made effective resistance impossible even when the military situation was not yet hopeless. Emperor Chongzhen spent his final night alive walking through the deserted halls of the Forbidden City, accompanied only by a single eunuch servant who had chosen to remain loyal unto death. The emperor visited each of his favorite chambers, touching precious artifacts that his ancestors had collected over nearly 3 centuries of rule, knowing that he would be the last Ming emperor to see these treasures as symbols of Chinese imperial power rather than as curiosities in a barbarian museum. His empress had already hanged herself rather than face capture, and his children had been hidden away with loyal servants who hoped to preserve the imperial bloodline for some future restoration that would never come. The emperor's final journey through his palace was both a farewell to his dynasty and a fulfillment of the nightmare that had haunted him for months. Each step echoed the dream sequences he had experienced, from the abandoned throne room to the deserted gardens where his concubines had once strolled in silk robes that cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime. The silence that surrounded him was the same supernatural quiet he had experienced in his prophetic vision, a stillness that seemed to mark the end not just of a dynasty, but of an entire cosmic epoch. The artifacts that Chongzhen touched during his final night included jade carvings that had been gifts from tributary kingdoms, calligraphy scrolls written by famous poets and philosophers, and astronomical instruments that had been used to calculate the auspicious dates for imperial ceremonies. Each object represented a different aspect of Chinese civilization that would soon pass into the hands of foreign rulers, transformed from living symbols of cultural continuity into museum pieces that testified to the greatness of a vanished world. The silk cord that the emperor used to hang himself on Coal Hill was the same type of cord he had seen in his prophetic dream, a detail that convinced his few remaining followers that the nightmare had been a genuine divine revelation, rather than a psychological manifestation of his fears about dynastic vulnerability. Chongzhen's suicide note blamed himself for the destruction of his dynasty, acknowledging that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Ming house, but he never understood how his obsession with preventing his prophetic dream had actually caused the events he most feared to unfold exactly as he had foreseen them. The location of the emperor's suicide was itself symbolic, as Coal Hill had been created from earth excavated during the construction of the Forbidden City, making it an artificial mountain that represented the intersection of human ambition and natural order. From the summit of this hill, Chongzhen could see the entire expanse of his former capital, now occupied by rebel forces who were already beginning to loot the palaces where he had once held court as the most powerful man on earth. The view from Coal Hill encompassed both the physical reality of his empire's collapse and the symbolic meaning of his dynasty's failure to maintain cosmic harmony. The discovery of the emperor's body by Li Zicheng's soldiers marked the end of the Ming dynasty, but also the beginning of a new phase in Chinese history that would be shaped by the competing claims of rebel leaders and foreign conquerors. Li attempted to present himself as the legitimate heir to imperial authority, but his peasant background and lack of cultural refinement made it impossible for him to master the sophisticated rituals that legitimized imperial rule in Chinese society. The Manchus, by contrast, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Chinese political culture that allowed them to present themselves as worthy successors to the Ming rather than as foreign usurpers. The Manchus, who established the Qing dynasty, were careful to present themselves as legitimate heirs to Chinese imperial tradition rather than as foreign conquerors, but they never forgot the lesson of how superstition and prophecy had helped destroy their predecessors. The early Qing emperors maintained elaborate court rituals, designed to demonstrate their connection to Chinese cosmic order, but they also established rational administrative systems that prioritized practical governance over mystical considerations. They understood that the Ming dynasty had fallen not because heaven had withdrawn its mandate, but because earthly rulers had become so obsessed with heavenly signs that they lost touch with earthly realities. The Qing approach to dream interpretation reflected their synthesis of Manchu pragmatism and Chinese mysticism. While they maintained the traditional court bureaucracy responsible for analyzing imperial dreams, they also established parallel advisory systems based on practical intelligence gathering and rational policy analysis. This dual approach allowed Qing emperors to honor Chinese cultural expectations about supernatural legitimacy, while also making decisions based on empirical evidence rather than symbolic interpretation. The administrative reforms implemented by the early Qing dynasty were designed to address the specific weaknesses that had made the Ming vulnerable to both rebellion and foreign conquest. The tax system was restructured to reduce the burden on agricultural communities. The military was reorganized to prevent the development of autonomous regional power bases, and the examination system was modified to ensure that government officials possessed practical skills rather than merely literary accomplishments. These reforms demonstrated that the Manchus had learned from their predecessors' mistakes rather than simply replacing one set of rulers with another. The irony of Chongzhen's prophetic nightmare was that it represented a genuine psychological insight into the structural weaknesses that were destroying his dynasty. But the emperor interpreted this insight as supernatural revelation rather than as a product of his own subconscious understanding of political reality. His dream accurately identified the three main threats to Ming survival: peasant rebellion, Manchu invasion, and the loss of military loyalty. But instead of addressing these threats through practical reforms and military strategies, he tried to combat them through ritual and prophecy. The emperor's nightmare was prophetic, not because it revealed the future, but because it revealed the present conditions that would inevitably produce that future if left unchanged. The psychological mechanism behind prophetic dreams has been studied by modern researchers who have discovered that the human subconscious mind is capable of processing vast amounts of information and identifying patterns that the conscious mind cannot recognize. Chongzhen's nightmare may have been his brain's attempt to warn him about dangers that he had unconsciously perceived but refused to consciously acknowledge. The dream's accuracy was not supernatural, but rather reflected the emperor's deep, if unconscious, understanding of the political and military trends that were threatening his dynasty's survival. The transformation of Li Zicheng from rebel leader to failed emperor illustrates the complex relationship between prophecy and political legitimacy in traditional Chinese culture. After capturing Beijing and driving Chongzhen to suicide, Li attempted to establish his own dynasty, based on promises to fulfill the social and economic reforms that had motivated his rebellion. However, Li's peasant background and lack of Confucian education made it impossible for him to master the sophisticated cultural codes that legitimized imperial rule in Chinese society. His inability to perform the ritual functions of emperorship, combined with his army's undisciplined behavior in the capital, convinced many Chinese that the Manchus might actually be more legitimate heirs to imperial tradition than the rebels who had overthrown the Ming. Li Zicheng's brief reign in Beijing revealed the enormous gap between military conquest and political legitimacy in traditional Chinese society. While Li had proven his ability to defeat imperial armies and capture the capital, he lacked the cultural knowledge necessary to perform the ceremonies that would convince educated Chinese that he possessed the mandate of heaven. His attempts to establish court rituals were clumsy imitations of Ming practices that only emphasized his unfamiliarity with the sophisticated protocols that had evolved over centuries of imperial rule. The failure of Li Zicheng's imperial experiment also demonstrated the importance of administrative competence in maintaining political power. Li's forces were effective at destroying the old order, but lacked the skills necessary to create a new one, leaving Beijing in a state of chaos that undermined popular confidence in rebel leadership. The contrast between Li's destructive capabilities and his constructive limitations made Manchu rule seem attractive to Chinese elites who valued stability and order above ideological purity or ethnic loyalty. Hong Taiji's son, who became the first Qing emperor to rule from Beijing, was only 6 years old when he ascended the throne, but his Manchu regents understood the importance of demonstrating continuity with Chinese imperial tradition, while also establishing their own cultural identity as legitimate rulers. The young emperor was given a Chinese name, Kangxi, and was educated in Confucian classics, but he was also taught Manchu military traditions and hunting skills that connected him to his nomadic heritage. This cultural synthesis allowed the Qing dynasty to present itself as both authentically Chinese and distinctively Manchu, avoiding the fate of previous foreign dynasties that had either been absorbed by Chinese culture or rejected by Chinese society. The education program designed for the young Qing emperor reflected sophisticated thinking about how foreign rulers could maintain legitimacy in Chinese society without losing their own cultural identity. The curriculum included traditional Chinese subjects like poetry, philosophy, and history, but also Manchu language, military strategy, and administrative practices that had proven effective in governing nomadic societies. This balanced approach produced rulers who could communicate effectively with Chinese subjects while also maintaining the martial traditions that had made Manchu conquest possible. The role of Chen Yuanyuan, Wu Sangui's concubine, whose capture by Li Zicheng triggered the general's betrayal of the Ming dynasty, reveals how personal relationships could determine the fate of empires in traditional Chinese politics. Chen was not merely a beautiful woman, but a highly educated courtesan who had been trained in poetry, music, and classical literature, making her a companion worthy of a high-ranking general rather than simply a sexual plaything. Her intelligence and cultural sophistication meant that Wu's relationship with her represented not just romantic attachment, but also intellectual and artistic partnership, which explains why her loss to Li Zicheng felt like such a devastating personal humiliation that it overrode Wu's dynastic loyalty. Chen Yuanyuan's biography illustrates the complex social position of educated courtesans in late imperial Chinese society. These women occupied a unique niche that allowed them to participate in intellectual culture, while remaining outside the rigid hierarchy that governed respectable family relationships. Their education and artistic talents made them valuable companions for powerful men who sought stimulating conversation and cultural refinement in addition to physical pleasure. The relationship between Wu Sangui and Chen Yuanyuan represented a form of companionate marriage that was difficult to achieve within the constraints of traditional arranged marriages between social equals. The cultural significance of Chen Yuanyuan's story extended far beyond her role in triggering Wu Sangui's betrayal, as she became a symbol of the personal costs of political upheaval in traditional Chinese literature and folklore. Later poets and dramatists used her story to explore themes of loyalty, love, and the conflict between personal desires and social obligations. Her tragedy became a metaphor for the destruction of beauty and refinement that inevitably accompanied political violence, making her a figure of romantic melancholy that appealed to audiences who had experienced their own losses during periods of dynastic transition. The military tactics employed by Li Zicheng's rebel army were innovative adaptations of traditional Chinese warfare designed to exploit the specific weaknesses revealed by the emperor's obsession with prophetic dreams. Li's forces avoided direct confrontation with imperial armies when possible, instead focusing on capturing key cities and winning over local populations through promises of tax relief and land redistribution. This strategy was psychologically devastating to Ming morale because it suggested that the rebels enjoyed genuine popular support rather than simply representing bandit opportunism, confirming the worst fears expressed in the emperor's nightmares about the loss of the heavenly mandate. The propaganda techniques used by Li Zicheng's movement were sophisticated applications of traditional Chinese political concepts adapted for rebellious purposes. Rather than rejecting imperial ideology entirely, Li's propagandists argued that the Ming dynasty had forfeited its right to rule through corruption and incompetence, making rebellion a patriotic duty rather than a criminal act. This approach allowed Li to present himself as a defender of traditional Chinese values, rather than as a revolutionary seeking to overthrow the established order, making his movement more acceptable to conservative elements of Chinese society. The economic factors that contributed to the Ming dynasty's collapse were largely ignored by Emperor Chongzhen in favor of supernatural explanations for his empire's troubles, but these material conditions were actually more decisive than any prophetic dream in determining the dynasty's fate. A series of natural disasters, including floods, droughts, and locust swarms, had devastated Chinese agriculture for decades, while the costs of defending against both internal rebellions and external invasions had bankrupted the imperial treasury. The emperor's response to these crises was to increase taxes on an already desperate population, while spending vast sums on ritual ceremonies designed to restore cosmic harmony, a combination that guaranteed continued rebellion regardless of any prophetic warnings. The climate change that affected China during the final decades of Ming rule was part of a global phenomenon known as the Little Ice Age, which caused agricultural disruption across Eurasia during the 16th and 17th centuries. Colder temperatures and irregular precipitation patterns reduced crop yields, just as population growth was increasing demand for food, creating a Malthusian crisis that no amount of ritual intervention could resolve. The emperor's failure to recognize the practical nature of these challenges meant that government resources were wasted on supernatural solutions while practical problems grew worse. The fiscal crisis that undermined Ming military effectiveness was exacerbated by a tax system that placed the heaviest burdens on the agricultural communities that were already suffering from natural disasters and population pressure. Rather than reforming this system to improve revenue collection and reduce popular grievances, Chongzhen increased tax rates and added new levies to fund his supernatural countermeasures against the threats revealed in his nightmare. This policy created a vicious cycle where higher taxes generated more rebellion, which required more military spending, which demanded even higher taxes, ultimately making the very disasters predicted in the emperor's dream inevitable, regardless of any mystical interventions. The cultural legacy of Chongzhen's prophetic nightmare extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of the Ming dynasty's collapse, influencing Chinese attitudes toward dreams, prophecy, and political legitimacy for centuries afterward. The Qing dynasty carefully cultivated the legend of the last Ming emperor's prophetic dream, presenting it as evidence that heaven itself had sanctioned the Manchu conquest of China. But this propaganda also reinforced traditional Chinese beliefs about the supernatural dimensions of political power. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking dreams too seriously, but also about the importance of paying attention to divine warnings about dynastic decline. The literary treatments of Chongzhen's nightmare by later Chinese writers revealed changing attitudes toward the relationship between supernatural beliefs and political responsibility. Early Qing authors emphasized the dream's accuracy as proof of heavenly approval for Manchu rule, while later writers began to question whether the emperor's response to his nightmare had actually caused the disasters he was trying to prevent. Modern Chinese historians have generally interpreted the story as an example of how superstition can undermine rational governance, though they continue to debate whether Chongzhen's dream contained genuine insights that might have saved his dynasty if properly understood. The ultimate irony of the Ming dynasty's destruction by a prophetic dream was that Emperor Chongzhen's nightmare contained genuine insights into the practical problems facing his empire, but his interpretation of these insights as supernatural warnings prevented him from taking the rational actions that might have addressed the underlying causes of dynastic crisis. If the emperor had understood his dream as a psychological reflection of real political and economic problems, rather than as a divine revelation about inevitable fate, he might have focused on military reforms, administrative improvements, and social policies that could have prevented the scenarios he feared most from becoming reality. Instead, his superstitious response to a rational warning ensured that his worst fears would be fulfilled with supernatural precision, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroyed one of the greatest empires in human history through the power of a single terrifying dream that revealed the truth while inspiring responses that made that truth into an inescapable destiny. In the end, it wasn't a rebellion or an invasion that toppled the Ming. It was a dream. A nightmare so vivid, it blinded a ruler to reality and led him straight into its jaws. Chongzhen saw the end, but by trying to escape it, he brought it to life. What if our deepest fears don't warn us, but summon the very fate we dread? Comment. What you think dreams really mean, like if this story shook your view of history, and subscribe, because next time it might be your nightmare that changes the world.